The morning sun cast golden light through the tall windows of the Vienna concert hall, and the grand building stood like a palace of dreams in the heart of the city. Its marble floors polished to perfection and its chandelier sparkling like 1,000 diamonds hanging from the ceiling. Inside this magnificent building, dozens of musicians had gathered for what many considered the most important piano competition in all of Europe. And the air was thick with nervous energy as young men and women in expensive suits and elegant dresses paced back and forth, their fingers moving in the air as they practiced invisible keys. Among this crowd of sophisticated musicians stood a small figure that seemed completely out of place, and her name was a 10-year-old girl with dark braided hair and large brown eyes that took in everything around her with a mixture of wonder and determination. She wore a simple white dress that her mother had sewn by hand, using fabric saved from 3 months of careful budgeting, and her shoes were old but clean, polished the night before with such care that they almost looked new. Beside her stood Sophia, her mother, a woman in her late 30s whose hands told the story of years of hard work, and her fingers were rough from scrubbing floors and washing dishes in the homes of wealthy families who never bothered to learn her name. Sophia kept her arm around her daughter's shoulders, partly to comfort the child and partly to draw strength from her, because this moment represented everything they had sacrificed and dreamed about for so long. The other contestants looked at Elara with expressions ranging from amusement to outright disbelief, and whispers floated through the waiting area like leaves carried by an unkind wind. "Is this some kind of joke?" a young man in his 20s asked his companion, not bothering to lower his voice. And he wore a suit that probably cost more than Sophia earned in 6 months of cleaning houses. Perhaps she wandered in from a children's birthday party. His friend replied with a cruel laugh, and several others joined in the mockery, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Elara heard every word, and she felt her cheeks grow warm with embarrassment. But she did not cry, and she did not hide behind her mother, because she remembered what her father had always told her about people who laughed at dreams. They did not understand. Sophia squeezed her daughter's hand and whispered in Romanian, telling her to ignore them, reminding her that the piano did not care about fancy clothes or expensive schools, and the piano only cared about the heart of the person who played it. At the front of the registration desk sat 3 judges who would decide the fate of every musician who performed that day, and among them was a man whose name was known in concert halls around the entire world. Victor Brennan was 52 years old, and he had once been celebrated as one of the greatest pianists of his generation, but a hand injury 15 years ago had ended his performing career and left him bitter toward the world. He now spent his days judging competitions and teaching at the Vienna Conservatory, and he had developed a reputation for being harsh and impossible to impress. With a tongue as sharp as broken glass, when Victor saw Elara's registration form come across his desk, he let out a sound that was something between a laugh and a groan, and he turned to the woman sitting beside him with an expression of complete disbelief. "They are letting anyone enter now," he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, and he shook his head as if personally offended by the presence of a child in this competition, a 10-year-old from some village in Romania. He continued, reading from the form with theatrical disgust, "And her teacher is listed as her father, who apparently played piano at a church. Not exactly the training ground for serious musicians." The other judges exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing, because Victor was the most senior among them and his word carried the weight of decades of experience and fame. Sophia felt anger rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm, because making a scene would only hurt Ilio's chances, and they had come too far to let pride destroy their opportunity. They had traveled 14 hours on a bus that smelled of diesel fuel and stale bread, sitting on seats that made Sophia's back ache and watching the countryside change from the familiar hills of Romania to the majestic mountains of Austria. They had spent the night in a tiny room above a bakery, the cheapest accommodation Sophia could find, and they had shared a single bed and a meal of bread and cheese that they brought from home because restaurant food was too expensive. All of this sacrifice, all of this hope, was now being mocked by people who had never known what it meant to count coins before buying groceries or to choose between medicine and music lessons. But Elara seemed unbothered by the laughter and the whispers, and she walked to a corner of the waiting room where a large window overlooked the city street below, and she pressed her small hand against the cold glass in her mind. She could hear her father's voice as clearly as if he was standing beside her, and he was telling her the same thing he had told her 1,000 times before he got sick. "Music is not about proving anything to anyone," Andrei had always said, his gentle eyes full of warmth and wisdom. "Music is about telling the truth that words cannot express, and when you play, you must forget the audience and remember only the song." Elara closed her eyes and took a deep breath, filling her lungs with air and her heart with courage, and she thought about the tiny keyboard at home with its 3 broken keys, the keyboard on which she had learned to create beauty from imperfection. She thought about her father's hands guiding hers across the keys, teaching her to feel the music before she heard it, showing her how each note connected to the next like links in a golden chain. She thought about the night he died, when she sat beside his bed and played Chopin's Ballade on a small recording device, so he could hear his favorite piece one last time, and the tears that fell on the keys as she played. These memories gave her strength, and she opened her eyes with a new sense of purpose, because she was not here to impress Victor Brennan or anyone else. She was here to keep a promise to a man who had believed in her when no one else did. Sophia watched her daughter from across the room and felt her heart swell with pride. Because in that moment, Alara looked exactly like Andrei. With the same quiet confidence and the same unshakable faith in the power of music, the minutes ticked by slowly. And one by one, the other contestants were called to perform. And each time someone returned from the stage, they looked either relieved or devastated depending on how their performance had gone. Victor Brennan showed no mercy to anyone, and his criticisms were delivered with the precision of surgical cuts, leaving even the most confident musicians questioning their years of training and practice. But Alara did not watch the other contestants or listen to the judges' comments, because her father had taught her that comparison was the enemy of art, and each musician had their own story to tell through their playing. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of waiting, a staff member appeared at the door and called out the name that would change everything. Ilara Dalka, the woman announced in a bored voice, already looking at her clipboard for the next name. Expecting nothing remarkable from the child contestant, Ilara stood up straight, smoothed her simple white dress, and looked at her mother with eyes full of love and determination. And in that single glance, 1,000 words passed between them. Sophia nodded once, fighting back tears, and whispered for Papa so quietly that only Alara could hear, and with those 2 words echoing in her heart, the little girl from Romania walked toward the stage where her destiny awaited, her small footsteps steady and sure on the marble floor that had witnessed countless musicians before her, none of whom had ever been quite like the child who walked upon it now. 3 years before Alara stood in the Grand Concert Hall of Vienna, she was a 7-year-old girl living in a small village nestled in the green hills of Romania, where life moved slowly and dreams were often considered luxuries that poor families could not afford. The village was called Luminita, which meant little light in Romanian, and it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where gossip traveled faster than the wind, and where most young people left as soon as they were old enough to seek better lives in the cities. In this humble village stood a small stone church with a bell tower that had been cracked by lightning years ago, and inside this church, every Sunday morning, a man named Andrei Delka sat at an old piano and filled the sacred space with music that made people forget their troubles. Andrei was not a famous musician, and he had never played in a concert hall or recorded an album, but the villagers believed that when he played, the angels themselves stopped to listen, and even the most hardened hearts would soften at the sound of his melodies. He worked during the week as a carpenter, building furniture and fixing roofs with hands that were rough from labor but gentle on the piano keys, and he earned just enough to keep his small family fed and sheltered. His wife Sophia worked as a cleaner in the nearby town, traveling 2 hours each day on a crowded bus to scrub floors in houses that seemed like palaces compared to their own modest home, and she never complained because she knew that every sacrifice was for Alara's future. Their home was a tiny cottage with walls that needed painting and a roof that leaked when the rain fell hard, but it was filled with love and music and laughter. And young Ilara never felt poor because she was rich in the things that truly mattered. In the corner of the small living room stood a keyboard that Andrei had bought second-hand from a music shop in the city, and 3 of its keys no longer worked properly, making certain notes sound weak or silent. But Andrei saw this as a teaching opportunity rather than a problem, and he would tell Ilara that a true musician must learn to create beauty from imperfection, because life itself is full of broken keys that we must learn to play around. Every evening after dinner, father and daughter would sit together at this keyboard, and Andrei would teach Ilara everything he knew about music, starting with simple scales and gradually moving to more complex pieces. He was a patient teacher who never raised his voice or showed frustration, and when Ilara made mistakes, he would simply smile and say that mistakes were just undiscovered melodies waiting to be understood. Listen with your heart, not just your ears, he would tell her as his fingers danced across the keys, because the notes are only part of the story, and the spaces between the notes are where the magic lives. Ilara absorbed every lesson like a flower absorbing sunlight, and by the time she was 7, she could play pieces that most children twice her age would struggle to master, and the villagers began to whisper that she had inherited her father's gift. Andrei dreamed of sending Ilara to a proper music, the academy where she could develop her talent under the guidance of professional teachers. But such schools cost money that a carpenter and a cleaning woman could never hope to save. Still, he never stopped dreaming, and he would often sit with Ilara on the front steps of their cottage, pointing at the stars and telling her stories about the great concert halls of Vienna and Paris and New York. One day, he would say with absolute certainty in his voice, "You will play in those halls, and people from all over the world will hear the music that lives inside you, and they will weep with joy just as I weep when I hear you play." Ilara believed every word because her father had never lied to her, and she practiced harder than ever, determined to make his dreams come true. Not knowing that time was already running out, the sickness came without warning, starting as a cough that Andrei dismissed as nothing serious, and by the time he finally agreed to see a doctor, the cancer had already spread too far for any treatment to help. The diagnosis was delivered in a cold hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and sorrow, and Sophia collapsed into a chair while Andrei simply nodded as if he had known all along that happiness was only ever borrowed, never owned. They could not afford the expensive treatments that might have extended his life by a few months, And so Andre chose to spend his remaining time at home with his wife and daughter, teaching Ilara as much as he could before the end came. Those final weeks were filled with music and tears, and moments of such profound love that they seemed to exist outside of time itself. And Andre played for Ilara whenever his strength allowed. Pouring everything he knew into her young and hungry mind, he recorded himself playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 on an old device that Sophia had borrowed from a neighbor, and he told Ilara that this piece contained everything he wanted to teach her about music and life. "Listen to this when you miss me," he said, his voice already growing weak. "And remember that I am always with you, in every note you play, in every dream you chase." On the night before he died, Andre called Ilara to his bedside, and Sophia stood in the doorway with tears streaming down her face, watching as her husband said goodbye to the daughter who had been the light of his life. "Promise me something," Andre whispered, taking Ilara's small hand in his own, and his skin was pale and cold, but his eyes still burned with the fire that had always defined him. "Promise me that you will never stop playing, no matter how hard life becomes, no matter how many people tell you that your dreams are impossible. Promise me that you will let the world hear your music." Ilara's tears fell onto her father's hand as she nodded, too overwhelmed with grief to speak, but Andre understood her silence better than any words could have expressed. "You have a gift," he continued, his breath coming in short gasps now, "and gifts are not meant to be hidden away. They are meant to be shared with the world. So share yours, my little star, and make the angels jealous with your playing." He died the next morning with a peaceful smile on his face, and the whole village came to his funeral, filling the little church where he had played so many beautiful songs over the years. The piano sat silent and empty, and no one dared to touch it because it felt like it belonged to Andre alone. But Sophia knew that her husband would have hated such reverence for an instrument that was meant to be played after the funeral. Sophia and Ilara returned to their empty cottage, and the silence was so heavy that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on their hearts that night. Ilara sat at the broken keyboard and began to play, her small fingers finding the keys through her tears, and she played her father's recording of Chopin over and over until she had memorized every note, every pause, every breath of the music. She made a decision in that moment that would shape the rest of her life, and she promised herself that she would honor her father's memory by becoming the musician he always knew she could be. Sophia watched her daughter from the kitchen doorway, and she made her own silent promise to do whatever it took to give Ilara the chance that Andre had dreamed of, even if it meant working twice as hard and sacrificing everything else. The days that followed were dark and difficult, and Sophia took on extra cleaning jobs that left her exhausted and aching, saving every coin she could spare in a tin box hidden under the floorboards. 3 years passed slowly, and Ilara practiced every single day without exception, growing stronger and more skilled with each passing month, and the villagers who heard her play through the thin walls of the cottage began to believe that Andre's spirit lived on in his daughter. When Sophia heard about the Vienna competition from a customer whose house she cleaned, she knew immediately that this was the opportunity they had been waiting for, and she counted the coins in the tin box with trembling hands. There was just enough for 2 bus tickets and a cheap room for one night, and Sophia made the decision without hesitation, because she knew that some chances only come once in a lifetime, and missing them was worse than any failure. And so mother and daughter set off on a journey that would either fulfill a dead man's dream or break their hearts forever, carrying nothing but hope and a promise that had been made on a cold winter night, when death came to take away the man they loved most in the world. Victor Brennan had seen thousands of musicians pass through these competition halls over the past 15 years, and he had learned to identify the mediocre ones within seconds of their first notes. Dismissing them in his mind long before their performances ended, he sat behind the judges' table with perfect posture, his silver hair combed back in the style he had worn since his days as a performing artist, and his expensive suit was tailored to hide the slight tremor in his left hand that had ended his career. That hand injury had occurred during a rehearsal in Berlin, a simple slip on a wet stage that had resulted in a fall that shattered the delicate bones in his wrist, and no amount of surgery or therapy had been able to restore the precision. He needed to perform at the highest level. The doctors had called it a tragedy, and the newspapers had written long articles about the loss to the music world. But Victor had simply locked himself away in his apartment for 3 months, refusing to see anyone or answer any calls. When he finally emerged, he was a different man, harder and colder and filled with a bitterness that he directed at every young musician who crossed his path. As if their talent was a personal insult to his own lost abilities, he had taken the position as head judge of the Muller competition, partly for the money and partly because it gave him power over the careers of others. And he used that power with the cruelty of someone who had forgotten what it meant to be vulnerable. The other judges respected his expertise but feared his temper, and they had learned long ago not to challenge his opinions or defend the musicians he chose to criticize. Today had been especially exhausting, with a parade of technically proficient but emotionally empty performances that had left Victor wondering if the art of piano playing was dying along with his own shattered dreams. He had delivered his criticisms with particular venom, reducing one young woman to tears with his comments about her mechanical interpretation that lacked any trace of genuine feeling, and watching her run from the stage had given him a dark satisfaction that he did not care to examine now. As the staff member announced the name of the next contestant, Victor glanced at his list and felt his irritation spike to new heights. Ilara Dalka, he read aloud, making no effort to pronounce the foreign name correctly. Age 10, from Romania. Prepared piece is Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. He let out a sound of disgust and turned to the judge beside him, a woman named Helena who had studied at the same conservatory as Victor many years ago. This is what the competition has become, he said loudly enough for everyone in the hall to hear. A joke, a circus where children are paraded before serious judges as if music were a talent show for amateurs. Helena shifted uncomfortably in her seat but said nothing, because she had learned that disagreeing with Victor only made things worse, and she had no desire to become the target of his sharp-tongued Chopin's Ballade. Victor continued with a bitter laugh. A piece that has defeated pianists with 30 years of training, and they expect us to sit here and watch a child butcher it like a lamb attempting surgery in the audience. Sophia heard every word, and she gripped the armrests of her seat so hard that her knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to stand up and defend her daughter against this cruel man who knew nothing about them. But Ilara was already walking toward the stage, and Sophia could do nothing but watch and pray, sending every ounce of love and hope she possessed toward the small figure in the white dress. The stage seemed enormous as Ilara crossed it, and the grand piano at its center was the most beautiful instrument she had ever seen, its black surface gleaming under the lights like a sleeping dragon waiting to be awakened. She could feel the eyes of the audience on her back, and she could sense their doubt and amusement, but she did not turn around to look at them because her father had taught her that an audience was not an enemy to be faced, but a friend to be won. The piano bench was too low for her, and she had to adjust it herself because no one offered to help, and she took her time getting it exactly right while Victor sighed loudly and tapped his pen against the table in impatience. Any day now, he muttered just loud enough for the sound to carry, and scattered laughter rippled through the hall from those who wanted to please the famous judge. Ilara heard the laughter, but she did not rush, because her father had taught her that preparation was just as important as performance, and a musician who began before they were ready was already defeated. She placed her hands in her lap and closed her eyes, and for a moment the entire hall fell silent. Unsure of what this strange child was doing in her mind, Ilara traveled back to her village, back to the small cottage with the leaking roof and the broken keyboard, back to the evenings when her father sat beside her and guided her fingers across the keys with infinite patience and love. She could hear his voice as clearly as if he was standing beside her now, telling her to breathe, telling her to listen to the silence before she filled it with sound, telling her that the music was already inside her and all she had to do was let it out. Victor watched this display of meditation with growing annoyance, and he was about to call out another sarcastic comment when something made him pause. There was something in the child's stillness that reminded him of the great masters he had seen perform in his youth, a quality of presence and focus that could not be taught or faked. He dismissed the thought almost immediately, telling himself that he was being foolish, that there was no way a 10-year-old from a village in Romania could possess the kind of depth that he had spent his entire career pursuing. Helena noticed a brief flicker of interest in Victor's expression and felt a small spark of hope, because she had grown tired of watching young musicians be destroyed by his cruelty, and she secretly wished for someone to prove him wrong. In the front row of the audience sat Sophia, her hands clasped together in her lap as if in prayer, her lips moving silently as she whispered encouragement to her daughter across the distance that separated them. She thought about Andrei and the dreams he had carried with him to his grave, and she wondered if he was watching from somewhere beyond the veil of death, waiting to see if their daughter would fulfill the promise she had made. The moment stretched on, and the audience grew restless, and Victor was just about to demand that the performance begin when Ilara opened her eyes. There was something different about her now, something that even the most skeptical observer would have had difficulty ignoring. The nervous child who had walked onto the stage was gone, replaced by a presence that seemed to fill the entire hall, and her eyes held a focus and intensity that belonged to someone far older than her years. She looked at the piano not as an obstacle to be overcome but as a partner to be embraced, and she placed her hands on the keys with a gentleness that was almost like a caress. Victor found himself leaning forward slightly, his pen frozen in midair, his cynical expression beginning to crack around the edges. The hall fell completely silent, and in that silence, everyone present could feel that something extraordinary was about to happen. Though none of them could have explained how they knew, Sophia held her breath, her heart pounding so hard that she was certain everyone around her could hear it, and she fixed her eyes on her daughter's small figure at the massive piano. Ilara took one final breath, filling her lungs with air and her heart with the memory of her father's love, and then she began to play. The first note floated through the concert hall like a secret being whispered from one soul to another, soft and delicate and filled with a longing that seemed impossible for such a young child to express. It was a single note, held just long enough to capture the attention of everyone present, and then it was joined by others that flowed from Ilara's fingers like water from a mountain spring, clear and pure and unstoppable. The opening passage of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 is known among pianists as one of the most difficult beginnings in all of classical music, requiring not just technical skill but also emotional depth and perfect control. Many experienced performers had stumbled over these first measures, their nerves betraying them at the crucial moment. But Alara played them as if she had been born knowing this music, as if the notes were as natural to her as breathing. Victor Brennan's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. But he did not notice because his entire attention was fixed on the small figure at the piano, and his mouth had fallen slightly open in disbelief. He had heard this piece performed hundreds of times by the greatest pianists of his generation, and he had played it himself at Carnegie Hall to standing ovations and rave reviews. But something about this child's interpretation was different. There was a quality to her playing that he could not name, a depth of feeling that seemed to reach beyond technique and training into something more fundamental, something that touched the very essence of what music was meant to be. Helena sat frozen beside him, her eyes wide with shock, and she watched as the impossible unfolded before her. As a 10-year-old girl from a Romanian village played with the soul of a master in the audience, Sophia's tears began to fall silently down her cheeks, and she did not bother to wipe them away because she was too transfixed by the miracle happening on stage. She heard Andrei in every note that Alara played, his spirit alive and present in the music, and she understood that he had not really left them after all, that he lived on in the gift he had passed to their daughter. The other contestants who had mocked Alara in the waiting room now stood in the wings of the stage, their expressions transformed from amusement to astonishment as they witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their lives. One young man who had laughed the loudest felt shame burn in his chest, and he wondered how he could have been so blind to what this child carried inside her, hidden beneath her simple dress and her village accent. Alara was not aware of any of this because she had traveled to a place beyond the concert hall, beyond Vienna, beyond the physical world itself. She was sitting in her father's lap at the old keyboard with the broken keys, and his hands were guiding hers through the music, and his voice was whispering in her ear, telling her that she was doing beautifully, that he was proud of her, that he would always be proud of her. The ballade moved through its first theme with a melancholy beauty that made several audience members reach for their handkerchiefs, and the emotional weight of the music seemed to grow heavier with each passing phrase. Chopin had composed this piece while longing for his homeland of Poland, pouring all his homesickness and sorrow into the notes, and somehow Alara understood this pain, translating it through her own experience of loss and longing. She played the transition passages with a fluidity that belied her age, her small hands stretching to reach the wide intervals that would challenge even adult performers, and she made it look effortless, as if the piano was simply an extension of her own body. Victor found himself holding his breath, afraid that any sound might break the spell that had been cast over the hall, and he realized with a start that his hands were trembling, not from his injury but from the emotion that was building in his chest. He had forgotten what this felt like, this complete surrender to the power of music, this overwhelming sense of being in the presence of something greater than oneself. For 15 years he had protected himself from such feelings, building walls of cynicism and bitterness around his wounded heart, but now those walls were crumbling, brought down by the playing of a child who should not have been able to touch him so deeply. The music reached a passage of particular technical difficulty, a cascade of notes that fell like a waterfall over rocks, requiring perfect coordination between both hands and absolute precision in timing. Alara navigated it flawlessly, her fingers dancing across the keys with a speed and accuracy that drew audible gasps from the professional musicians in the audience. But it was not the technique that amazed them, because technique could be taught and practiced and perfected through years of dedicated study. It was the way she made the technique invisible, the way she used it not as an end in itself but as a means to express something deeper, something that went beyond mere notes and rhythms into the territory of pure emotion. The ballade moved into its lyrical second theme, a melody so beautiful that it seemed to float above the underlying harmonies like a bird, soaring over mountains. Alara played this theme with a tenderness that made hearts ache throughout the hall, and more than one hardened music critic felt their eyes grow moist as they listened. She was thinking of her father now, remembering the nights when he would carry her to bed after she had fallen asleep at the keyboard, remembering the way he would kiss her forehead and whisper that she was his little star, his greatest treasure. These memories flowed through her fingers and into the piano, transforming personal grief into universal beauty, and everyone who listened felt that they were being given a glimpse into something sacred and private. Victor's throat had tightened, and he realized that he was fighting back tears, something he had not done since the day he learned his career was over. He thought about his own father, a stern man who had pushed him toward music from the age of 4, never offering praise, only criticism, and he wondered for the first time if his bitterness was not about his injury at all, but about wounds that had been inflicted long before. Helena noticed Victor's emotion and felt her own heart soften, because she had known him for over 30 years and had never seen him so vulnerable, so human. The music built toward a moment of climax, the notes growing louder and more intense, and Alara's whole body moved with the passion of the piece, her small frame swaying as if she were being carried by waves of sound. The audience had stopped breathing, stopped thinking, stopped being separate individuals, and had become instead a single entity united by the experience of witnessing something extraordinary. Even the stage crew, hardened professionals who had seen hundreds of performances, stood frozen at their posts, their routine tasks forgotten as they listened to the music that filled the hall. Ilara's eyes remained closed, and tears were streaming down her cheeks, but her hands never faltered, never missed a single note, as if they were being guided by a force greater than her conscious will in that moment. She was not a 10-year-old girl competing for a prize. She was a vessel for something eternal, a channel through which the spirit of music itself flowed into the physical world. The passage built to its peak and then began to descend, like a wave that has crashed upon the shore and is now retreating back into the ocean. And the hall seemed to exhale as the tension released, but the ballade was not over, and everyone present knew that the most challenging parts were still to come. The technically demanding passages that separated good pianists from great ones. Ilara opened her eyes for just a moment, and they seemed to glow with an inner light, and she looked not at the audience or the judges but at something beyond them, something that only she could see. Then she closed her eyes again, and her fingers flew across the keys, and the music surged forward with renewed energy, carrying everyone in the hall along with it on a journey that none of them would ever forget. Victor felt a single tear escape from the corner of his eye and roll down his weathered cheek, and he did not bother to hide it because in that moment he did not care who saw. He understood now what he had been missing all these years, what his bitterness had cost him, and he made a silent vow that whatever happened after this day, he would never allow himself to become so close to beauty again. Sophia clutched her hands together so tightly that her fingernails left marks in her palms, and she watched her daughter with a love so fierce that it felt like it might burst from her chest. The music continued to pour from the piano, filling every corner of the grand hall, reaching into every heart that was open enough to receive it, and somewhere, in a place beyond the reach of mortal eyes, a father smiled with joy and pride, knowing that his little star was finally beginning to shine. The ballade surged into its most demanding passages, and Ilara's fingers moved with a speed and precision that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Each note perfectly placed, each phrase perfectly shaped. This was the section where most performers faltered, where the technical demands of the music overwhelmed even the most skilled pianists. But Ilara navigated it with a grace that made it look like child's play. The irony of that phrase was not lost on Victor, who had spent months mastering this very passage in his youth, practicing until his fingers bled and his back ached from hours of sitting at the piano. He had always been proud of his technique, considering it his greatest strength as a performer, but watching this girl play, he realized that technique without soul was like a body without breath. Ilara had both, and she wielded them together like weapons of beauty, cutting through the defenses that Victor had built around his heart over 15 years of bitterness and disappointment. The music rose and fell like breathing, like waves, like the rhythm of life itself, and everyone in the hall felt themselves being carried along by its power. Helena had given up trying to maintain her professional composure, and tears were flowing freely down her face as she listened to something she knew she would remember until the day she died. She thought about her own daughter, a teenager who had recently announced that she hated music and wanted to quit her piano lessons, and she vowed to go home and really listen to a child for the first time in years. In the wings of the stage, the young man who had mocked Ilara earlier was now slumped against a wall, his face pale with the shock of confronting his own arrogance. He had trained at the most prestigious conservatory in Germany, had won competitions across Europe, and yet he knew with absolute certainty that he could not play like this child, that perhaps no one in his generation could play like this child. The realization was humbling, and for the first time in his life, he understood that there was a difference between learning music and becoming music. Ilara was not performing the ballade, she was living it, breathing it, being it, and the distinction was as clear as the difference between a photograph and the living thing it captured. The middle section of the piece brought a brief moment of calm, a lyrical passage that seemed to float above the turbulence that had come before, and Ilara played it with such tenderness that several audience members began to sob openly. Sophia recognized this passage as one of Andre's favorites, a melody he used to hum while cooking dinner or working on his carpentry projects, and hearing it now was like receiving a message from beyond the grave. She closed her eyes and let the music wash over her, and she could almost feel her husband's presence beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his voice in her ear telling her that everything was going to be all right. Victor had completely forgotten that he was supposed to be judging this performance, that he had notes to take and criticisms to prepare. He was simply listening, simply feeling, simply allowing himself to be transformed by the power of what he was hearing. He remembered why he had fallen in love with music in the first place, back when he was younger than Ilara, back before competitions and careers and critics had turned something beautiful into a battlefield. He remembered sitting in his grandmother's house, listening to her play old folk songs on a battered upright piano, and feeling that the music was speaking directly to his soul. Somewhere along the way, he had lost that feeling, buried it beneath layers of ambition and disappointment, and now this child from Romania was digging it up again, forcing him to confront the person he had once been and the person he had become. The ballade moved into its final section, the most emotionally intense part of the entire piece, where all the themes that had come before were woven together into a tapestry of sound that was simultaneously triumphant and heartbreaking. Ilara's playing grew more passionate, more urgent, and her small body seemed to channel energies far greater than herself, as if she were merely the instrument through which the music was being expressed. The piano sang under her touch, its voice filling the hall with a richness and depth that seemed impossible from a mere mechanical device of wood and wire and ivory. Victor found himself gripping the arms of his chair, his knuckles white, his breath coming in short gasps. As if he were the one performing rather than listening, he had performed this piece dozens of times in his career, had received standing ovations and glowing reviews from the most demanding critics in the world. But he had never played it like this. No one had ever played it like this. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, and he understood that he was witnessing something that happened perhaps once in a generation. The emergence of a talent so profound that it would reshape the entire landscape of classical music. This child was not just good, not just exceptional, not just prodigious. She was a once-in-a-lifetime phenomenon, a gift from the gods of music to a world that had forgotten how to truly listen. The final passages of the ballade approached, and Alara played them with an abandon that was both controlled and wild, both precise and free, a paradox that only the greatest musicians could achieve. Her fingers struck the keys with increasing force, building toward a climax that seemed to draw every atom of air in the hall into its vortex. The audience leaned forward as one, pulled by an invisible force toward the small figure at the piano, and their hearts beat in rhythm with the music. Sophia was no longer crying silently. Her sobs had become audible, and she did not care who heard or what they thought, because her daughter was fulfilling a promise made to a dying man, and nothing else in the world mattered. The climax arrived with a crash of chords that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building, a moment of pure emotional release that left everyone breathless, and then, as quickly as it had risen, the music began to fade, the final notes falling like leaves in autumn. Gentle and inevitable and achingly beautiful, Alara played the closing passage with a simplicity that was more moving than any technical display could have been, each note placed with such care that it seemed to hang in the air like a final farewell. The last note sounded, a single tone that contained within it all the joy and sorrow of human existence. And then there was silence, complete, total, profound silence. Alara's hands rested on the keys, and she remained perfectly still, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and no one dared to break it, because everyone sensed that they were standing on sacred ground. Victor was the first to move, and what he did shocked everyone who knew him, everyone who had witnessed his cruelty and cynicism over the years. He rose slowly from his chair, pushing it back with a scraping sound that echoed through the silent hall, and he stood facing the stage with tears streaming openly down his face. His hands came together in the first clap, a single sound that broke the spell and released the emotion that had been building in every heart present. The audience erupted in response, hundreds of people leaping to their feet, their applause thundering through the hall like a waterfall of sound. Helena stood beside Victor, clapping so hard that her palms stung, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen in 15 years, something that looked like hope, something that looked like redemption. The other judges rose as well, abandoning all pretense of professional detachment, joining the standing ovation that would continue for over 5 minutes backstage. The young musicians who had been waiting for their turn to perform were weeping and applauding, their own ambitions forgotten in the face of what they had just witnessed. Sophia pushed through the crowd, running toward the stage, her heart bursting with a pride and love so intense that she thought she might die from the sheer force of it. Alara finally opened her eyes, and she looked out at the sea of faces before her, all of them standing, all of them weeping, all of them applauding as if their lives depended on it. She did not understand why they were reacting this way, because she had simply played the music the way her father had taught her, the way she always played when she remembered him and missed him and loved him. She looked for her mother in the crowd, and when their eyes met, she finally smiled, a small, shy smile that made her look exactly like what she was, a 10-year-old girl who had just kept a promise to her father. And in that moment, everyone who saw her smile understood that what they had witnessed was not just a performance, it was a miracle. The applause continued to thunder through the concert hall like a storm that refused to end, and Alara sat at the piano bench feeling confused and overwhelmed by the reaction of the crowd before her. She had expected polite clapping, perhaps a few nods of approval, maybe even some criticism from the judges, who had looked at her with such disdain before she began to play. But this was something else entirely, something she had never experienced and could not understand. And she looked around the hall with wide eyes, trying to make sense of what was happening. Every single person in the audience was standing, their hands coming together again and again, their faces wet with tears, their voices rising in shouts of bravo that echoed off the golden walls. Victor Brennan remained on his feet, his hands clapping so hard that they had begun to turn red, and his cheeks were streaked with tears that he made no effort to hide. He had not cried in public since his mother's funeral 20 years ago, and he had certainly never cried at a piano competition. But something about this child's playing had broken through every defense he had built around his wounded heart. Helena stood beside him, her own tears flowing freely, and she reached out to touch his arm in a gesture of solidarity that surprised them both. "I have never heard anything like that," she whispered. though her words were lost in the roar of the crowd. Not in 30 years of listening to pianists from around the world. Victor could only nod, because his throat was too tight to speak, and he continued to clap as if his hands were moving of their own accord. The other contestants who had gathered in the wings of the stage were transformed, their mockery replaced by something that looked like reverence. The young man who had laughed loudest at Ilara's simple dress was now weeping openly, his expensive suit forgotten, his arrogance shattered by the realization that talent had nothing to do with money or training or pedigree. He pushed through the group and walked onto the stage, and before anyone could stop him, he knelt before Ilara and took her small hand in his. "Forgive me," he said in a voice choked with emotion. "I was a fool. I judged you without knowing you, and I am sorry." Ilara looked at him with confusion, not understanding why this stranger was apologizing to her, but she nodded and offered him a small smile because her father had taught her that kindness was always the right response. The young man rose and stepped back, and others followed his lead, coming onto the stage to offer their congratulations and their apologies, creating a circle of admirers around the bewildered child. But Ilara was looking past all of them, searching the crowd for the one face she needed to see, the face of her mother who had sacrificed everything to bring her to this moment. Sophia was pushing through the audience, her progress slowed by people who wanted to shake her hand and congratulate her on raising such an extraordinary daughter. "Let me through," she kept saying, her voice breaking with emotion. "Please, I need to see my daughter." The crowd parted for her, recognizing the desperation of a mother who needed to hold her child. And Sophia finally reached the edge of the stage. She did not bother with the steps. She simply pulled herself up onto the platform and ran to Ilara, gathering her daughter in an embrace so tight that neither of them could breathe. "You did it," Sophia whispered into Ilara's hair, her voice thick with tears. "You did it, my love. Your father would be so proud." Ilara finally began to cry then, the tears she had been holding back since she sat down at the piano flooding out of her in great heaving sobs. "I heard him, Mama," she said, her small body shaking in her mother's arms. "While I was playing, I heard Papa's voice. He was with me the whole time." Sophia closed her eyes and held her daughter tighter, believing every word, because she had felt Andre's presence too, had sensed him in every note that Ilara played. The applause began to fade as the audience realized they were witnessing a private moment between mother and daughter, and a respectful silence fell over the hall. Victor watched from the judges' table, his hand pressed against his chest where his heart was beating with an intensity he had not felt in years. He thought about all the young musicians he had crushed with his cruel words over the years, all the dreams he had shattered because his own had been taken from him, and he felt a shame so deep that it threatened to drown him. But alongside the shame was something else, something that felt like hope, like a door opening onto a room he had kept locked for 15 years. This child had given him a gift, he realized, not just the gift of her music but the gift of remembering why he had devoted his life to this art in the first place. Music was not about competition or criticism or proving oneself better than others. It was about connection, about touching the human soul in ways that words could never achieve. Ilara had reminded him of this truth, and he knew that he could never go back to being the bitter, cynical man he had been just an hour ago. The competition continued after that, because there were rules and procedures that had to be followed, but everyone knew that the outcome was already decided. Other contestants took the stage and played their prepared pieces, and some of them played quite well, but nothing could compare to what Ilara had done. The judges listened politely and took their notes, but their hearts were no longer in it, because they had witnessed something that transcended the normal boundaries of a piano competition. When the final performer finished and the judges retired to make their decision, the conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Victor spoke first, his voice still rough with emotion, and he said that there was no question about the winner, that giving the prize to anyone other than Ilara would be a crime against music itself. Helena agreed immediately, as did the third judge, a quiet man named Friedrich, who had been teaching piano for 40 years and claimed he had never seen anything like what he had witnessed today. The announcement was made to a crowd that had remained in their seats, unwilling to leave without knowing the official result, even though the outcome was obvious to everyone. When Victor called Ilara's name as the winner of the Muller piano competition, the hall erupted once again in thunderous applause. But Ilara did not seem particularly interested in the trophy or the prize money or the scholarship offers that would soon pour in from every major conservatory in Europe. She held her mother's hand and smiled her small, shy smile. And when reporters asked her how she felt about her victory, she said only one thing: "I wish my papa could have been here to see it." And somewhere beyond the reach of mortal eyes, in a place where music never ends and love never dies, Andre Dulka smiled and whispered to the wind, "I was here, my little star. I was here the whole time." The backstage area of the concert hall was chaos in the hours following Ilara's victory, with reporters shouting questions and photographers pushing for position and well-wishers trying to catch a glimpse of the young prodigy who had captivated the world. Sophia stood guard over her daughter like a lioness protecting her cub, turning away interview requests and declining photograph opportunities because Ilara was exhausted and overwhelmed, and needed rest more than she needed fame. They had retreated to a small dressing room behind the stage, a modest space with a worn couch and a mirror surrounded by bright lights, and Alara had curled up on the couch with her head in her mother's lap. Sophia stroked her daughter's hair and hummed an old Romanian lullaby that Andrei used to sing. And gradually the noise from outside began to fade as the crowds dispersed and the hall emptied. A knock came at the door, soft and tentative. So different from the aggressive pounding of the reporters who had been trying to get in all evening. Sophia hesitated, not wanting to disturb Alara, who had finally fallen asleep. But something about the knock made her feel that this was someone she should see come in. She said quietly, hoping that whoever was on the other side would have the sense to be quiet. The door opened slowly, and Victor Brennan stepped into the room. His confident posture replaced by something that looked almost like humility. He had removed his suit jacket and loosened his tie, and his silver hair was slightly disheveled as if he had been running his hands through it in distress. "Forgive me for intruding," he said in a voice barely above a whisper, his eyes moving to the sleeping child on the couch. "I can come back another time if this is not appropriate." Sophia studied his face for a long moment, remembering the cruel comments he had made before Iliro's performance, the way he had dismissed her daughter as a joke, but she also remembered the tears streaming down his face as he led the standing ovation, the way his cynicism had crumbled in the face of something he could not deny. "Please," she said, gesturing to a chair in the corner of the room. "Sit down, but quietly. She is very tired." Victor nodded and lowered himself into the chair, his movements careful and slow, and he sat with his hands clasped in his lap like a penitent, seeking forgiveness. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence broken only by the soft sound of Alara's breathing and the distant noise of the cleaning crew beginning their work in the main hall. Finally, Victor cleared his throat and began to speak, his words coming slowly as if each one cost him great effort. "I owe you an apology," he said, keeping his voice low, "and I owe your daughter an apology, though I know that words cannot undo the damage of what I said before she played." Sophia remained silent, waiting for him to continue, not making it easy for him because she remembered too clearly the pain of hearing her daughter dismissed and mocked. "I have been judging these competitions for 15 years, Victor continued, "and in that time I have become something I am ashamed of, a bitter old man who takes pleasure in crushing the dreams of young musicians." He paused and looked down at his hands, the hands that had once created such beautiful music and now trembled with a palsy that would never heal. "When I was younger, I was a performer," he said. "Perhaps you have heard of me, perhaps not. It does not matter now. What matters is that I loved music the way your daughter loves it, with my whole heart and soul." Sophia nodded slowly, because she had in fact heard of Victor Brennan, had even owned one of his recordings years ago before poverty forced her to sell everything of value and injury ended my career. Victor said, holding up his left hand to show the slight tremor that was visible even in the dim light, "And I allowed that loss to poison everything that came after." He looked at Ilara's sleeping form, and his eyes filled with fresh tears that he did not try to hide. "I convinced myself that true artistry was dead, that no one would ever again play with the kind of passion and depth that I believed I had possessed. And when young musicians came before me full of hope and talent, I took pleasure in destroying them." Sophia felt her anger softening despite herself, because she recognized in Victor's confession the kind of pain that transforms people into shadows of who they once were. "Your daughter has changed me," Victor said, his voice cracking with emotion. "In the span of one performance, she showed me everything I had been denying for 15 years. She showed me that music is not dead, that beauty is not dead, that there are still souls in this world capable of touching the divine." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and took a deep breath before continuing. "I want to help her," he said, "not because I feel guilty, although I do feel guilty, but because she has a gift that must be nurtured and protected, a gift that comes perhaps once in a generation." Sophia's heart began to beat faster, because she had spent the last 3 years worrying about how she would afford to give Alara the training she deserved. "What do you mean by help?" she asked carefully, not wanting to seem desperate even though desperation was exactly what she felt. Victor leaned forward in his chair, his expression earnest and open in a way that would have shocked anyone who knew his reputation. "I want to pay for her education," he said. "All of it, whatever conservatory she chooses, whatever teachers she needs, whatever instruments she requires. I will cover every expense until she is ready to launch her career." Sophia stared at him in disbelief, unable to process what she was hearing, because such generosity seemed impossible from a man who had been so cruel just hours before. "But why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would you do this for us? You do not know us. You do not owe us anything." Victor smiled sadly and looked again at Ela, sleeping peacefully with no knowledge of the conversation that was determining her future. "I do owe you something," he said. "I owe you my gratitude, because your daughter has given me back something I thought I had lost forever." He stood up and walked to the couch, kneeling beside it so that he could look at Ilara's face more closely. "She has given me hope," he whispered, "and for a man who has lived without hope for 15 years, that is worth more than all the money in the world." Sophia felt tears streaming down her own face now, and she reached out to touch Victor's shoulder in a gesture of forgiveness and acceptance. "My husband was her teacher," she said, her voice soft with memory. "He was a carpenter who played piano at our village church. He was not famous or wealthy or trained at any conservatory." Victor listened intently, hungry for any information about how such a remarkable talent had been developed. He taught her that music comes from the heart, not from the fingers, Sophia continued. He taught her that every note is a word in a conversation with the universe, and that the greatest musicians are those who learn to listen as much as they play. Victor nodded slowly, understanding now why Ilara's playing had touched him so deeply. He sounds like a wise man, he said. I wish I could have met him. He would have liked you, Sophia said. Though she was not entirely sure this was true, he believed that everyone deserves a second chance, that no one is beyond redemption. Victor rose to his feet and extended his hand to Sophia, a formal gesture that carried within it the weight of a sacred promise. I will not let you down, he said as she took his hand. I will not let her down. On my honor as a musician and as a man who has finally remembered what music is supposed to mean. Sophia shook his hand firmly, sealing a partnership that would change not only Ilara's life but Victor's as well, and in her sleep. Ilara smiled, as if she could sense that the future her father had dreamed of was finally beginning to take shape. In the audience during Ilara's performance had sat a young woman named Katya, a journalism student from the University of Vienna who had come to the competition as part of an assignment for her media class. She was 23 years old, with short red hair and a nose ring that her professor constantly criticized, and she had expected the competition to be boring. Just another evening of classical music that she would have to pretend to appreciate. But when Ilara began to play, Katya felt something shift inside her, something that made her reach for a phone and press the record button without even thinking about what she was doing. She held the phone steady throughout the entire performance, her arms aching from the effort, her eyes filling with tears that she would later pretend had never fallen when the standing ovation began. Katya kept recording, capturing Victor's tears and the crowd's reaction, and the moment when Sophia ran to embrace her daughter on stage that night, back in her small apartment that she shared with 2 other students, Katya uploaded the video to her social media account with a simple caption that would change everything. A 10-year-old just made a world-famous pianist cry, she wrote, adding a few relevant hashtags and expecting maybe a few hundred views from her followers. She went to bed without checking her phone again, exhausted from the emotional experience of the evening and the long walk home through Vienna's cold streets. When she woke up the next morning, her phone had crashed from the number of notifications it was trying to process. The video had been viewed 3 million times while she slept, and that number was climbing by thousands every minute as people around the world shared it with their friends and families. Katya sat up in bed and stared at her screen in disbelief, watching the view counter rise like a rocket launching into space. By noon, the video had 10 million views, and by evening it had reached 20 million and was showing no signs of slowing down. News outlets from every corner of the globe began picking up the story, and Katya's inbox filled with requests for interviews and offers to buy the exclusive rights to her footage. The New York Times wrote an article about the Romanian prodigy who conquered Vienna, and the BBC ran a segment on their evening news showing clips from the performance. Television stations in Tokyo and Sydney and Sao Paulo and Cairo all broadcast the story, and Ilara's face appeared on screens in living rooms and cafes and airport lounges around the entire world. Social media exploded with posts about the little girl in the white dress, and hashtags like Eleanotha Pianist and Miracle in Vienna trended globally for days. People who had never listened to classical music in their lives found themselves weeping at 3 in the morning as they watched Ilara play Chopin on their phones. Famous musicians posted their reactions, with legendary pianists praising her technique and her emotional depth in terms usually reserved for performers with decades of experience. One celebrated concert pianist wrote that he had taught at Juilliard for 30 years and had never encountered a talent like Ilara, calling her a gift from the gods of music to a world that desperately needs beauty. The video spawned countless reaction videos, with people filming themselves as they watched Ilara's performance for the first time, their expressions moving from skepticism to shock to tears. Parents shared the video with their children, hoping to inspire them to practice their own instruments, and music teachers played it for their students as an example of what was possible when talent met dedication. But not everyone was supportive, because the internet is a place where kindness and cruelty exist side by side. Some commenters accused the whole thing of being fake, claiming that no child could play like that without some kind of technological assistance or editing. Others attacked Ilara's appearance, mocking her simple dress and her village background and her thick, the Romanian accent when she spoke in interviews. A few cruel individuals even sent threatening messages to the email address that Katya had foolishly included in her original post, forcing her to take down her contact information and involve the police. Sophia tried to shield Ilara from the negative attention, but it was impossible to hide the reality of what was happening when reporters camped outside their cheap hotel room and paparazzi followed them everywhere they went. The little girl who had played with such confidence and joy began to seem overwhelmed, her smile becoming forced, her eyes losing some of their sparkle. Victor saw what was happening and stepped in, using his connections and his reputation to help Sophia manage the flood of attention. He arranged for them to stay in a private apartment owned by a friend, a place where no reporters could find them, and he hired a publicist to handle the media requests and filter out the negativity. Scholarship offers began arriving from the most prestigious music schools in the world, including Juilliard in New York, the Royal Academy of Music in London, and the Paris Conservatory. Each letter promised full financial support, world-class instruction, and opportunities that Sophia had never dared to dream of for her daughter. But amidst all the chaos and excitement, Elara remained focused on what mattered most to her. "I want to go home," she told her mother one evening as they sat together in the borrowed apartment. "I want to visit Papa's grave and tell him what happened." Sophia looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and sadness, because this simple request reminded her that beneath all the fame and attention, Elara was still just a 10-year-old girl who missed her father. "We will go home," Sophia promised, taking Elara's hand in her own. "Before we make any decisions about schools or scholarships or anything else, we will go home." Victor supported this decision completely, telling the media that Elara needed time to rest and process everything that had happened before she could consider any offers. The publicist released this statement thanking the world for its support and asking for privacy during this difficult time. And slowly the intensity of the attention began to fade, but the video remained a permanent record of the moment when a little girl from a Romanian village had touched the hearts of millions and reminded the world that true magic still exists. It had been viewed over 50 million times by the end of the week, making it one of the most watched classical music performances in the history of the internet. And in villages and cities and suburbs around the world, children who had never cared about piano before began asking their parents for music lessons, inspired by the girl in the white dress who had made a famous pianist cry. This was perhaps the greatest miracle of all, not the fame or the scholarships or the media attention, but the simple fact that Elara's music had awakened something beautiful in people who had forgotten how to feel. Her father would have loved that, Sophia thought, as she watched the sunset from the apartment window. He would have said that was the whole point of music in the first place. The bus that carried Sophia and Elara back to their village wound through the mountains of Romania like a snake following an ancient path, and the familiar landscape passing outside the window felt like a welcome embrace after the chaos of Vienna. Elara pressed her face against the glass, watching the green hills and the small farms and the clusters of houses that grew more recognizable with each passing mile. She had been away for less than a week, but it felt like a lifetime had passed since she had last seen these rolling fields and heard the church bells ringing across the valley. Sophia sat beside her daughter with her eyes closed, exhausted from the journey and the stress and the overwhelming flood of emotions that had consumed them both since the competition. In her bag she carried the trophy that Elara had won, a beautiful crystal sculpture shaped like a grand piano, and she also carried a folder full of scholarship offers that would need to be answered eventually. But for now, none of that mattered, because they were going home, and home was where they needed to be. The bus pulled into the village square, just as the afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western hills, casting long shadows across the cobblestones that Elara had walked 1,000 times before. She expected to step off the bus into the quiet emptiness of an ordinary day, but instead she found the entire village waiting for them. Every person who lived in Luminita seemed to have gathered in the square, from the oldest grandmother to the youngest baby. And when Elara appeared in the bus doorway, they erupted in cheers and applause. The butcher and the baker and the woman who sold vegetables in the market were all there, and so were the children Elara had grown up with and the teachers who had taught her in school. Father Bo, the priest who had been Andrei's closest friend, stood at the front of the crowd with tears streaming down his weathered face. "Welcome home, little star," he called out, using the nickname that Andrei had given her. "Your father is smiling in heaven today." Elara was overwhelmed by the welcome, and she clung to her mother's hand as they made their way through the crowd, accepting hugs and kisses and words of congratulation from people who had known her since before she was born. Someone had hung a banner across the front of the church that read "Our Pride of Luminita," and the sight of it made Sophia burst into tears. These were the same people who had whispered behind their backs when Andrei was alive, calling him a dreamer and a fool for thinking his daughter could ever amount to anything in the world of music. Now they were celebrating as if they had always believed, and Sophia chose to forgive them because that was what Andrei would have wanted. The crowd parted to let them through, and Elara walked with purpose toward the small cemetery behind the church, where her father was buried. She had something important to do, something she had been thinking about since the moment the applause began in Vienna, and she would not rest until it was done. The grave was simple, a wooden cross with Andrei's name carved into it, and a small patch of flowers that the neighbors had been tending in Sophia's absence. Elara knelt on the grass beside the grave and removed the crystal trophy from her mother's bag, placing it carefully at the base of the cross. "I kept my promise, Papa," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears that were falling from her eyes. "I played for the world like you asked me to, and they heard the music that lives inside me." She paused, as if waiting for a response, and the wind rustled through the trees as if carrying a message from somewhere beyond. "I heard you while I was playing," she continued. "I heard your voice telling me to breathe, telling me to feel the music, telling me that you were proud of me." Sophia stood a few feet away, giving her daughter space to have this private conversation with the father she had lost too soon. "I miss you every day," Elara said, her voice breaking now, and I wish you could have been there to see the people standing and crying and clapping. I wish you could have seen Mama's face when they announced I had one. She reached out and touched the wooden cross, tracing her fingers over the letters of her father's name. But I know you were watching, she whispered. I know you are always watching, and I promise I will never stop playing. I will never stop making the music you taught me to make. She stayed by the grave for a long time, talking to her father about everything that had happened. And Sofia did not rush her because some moments are too sacred to interrupt. When Elara finally stood up, her face was peaceful, as if a weight had been lifted from her small shoulders. I want to play for him, she said to her mother. I want to play in the church where he used to play, so he can hear me one more time. Sofia nodded, because she understood that this was not a request but a need, and she would have moved mountains to give her daughter what she needed. Word spread quickly through the village that Elara was going to perform in the church, and by the time evening fell, every pew was filled with people who had come to witness something they sensed would be extraordinary. The old piano where Andre had played for so many years stood at the front of the church, and someone had polished it until it gleamed in the candlelight. But Elara hesitated when she saw it, because this was not the piano she remembered. The village took up a collection, Father Bogdan explained, seeing her confusion. After your video went viral, people from around the world sent money to restore your father's piano. He smiled through his tears and added, there is even money left over to replace the keyboard in your cottage, the one with the broken keys. Elara walked slowly to the piano and sat down on the bench where her father had sat so many Sunday mornings, and she felt his presence so strongly that she could almost see him standing beside her. She did not play Chopin this time, because that piece belonged to Vienna and to the competition and to the moment when the world had first heard her music. Instead, she played a simple Romanian folk song that Andre had taught her when she was 5 years old, a lullaby about a shepherd watching over his flock under the stars. The villagers recognized the melody immediately, because Andre had played it at weddings and funerals and baptisms for as long as anyone could remember. Tears flowed freely as the familiar notes filled the sacred space, and people held hands with their neighbors and remembered the man who had given them so much joy with his music. Sofia sat in the front pew with her eyes closed, and she could see Andre so clearly in her memory, his gentle smile and his kind eyes and the way his fingers had danced across these very keys when the song ended. There was no thunderous applause, only a profound silence that spoke louder than any ovation could. Father Bogdan rose and made the sign of the cross over the congregation, and then he spoke words that would be remembered in the village for generations. Tonight we have witnessed a miracle, he said, his voice echoing through the church, the miracle of a father's love living on in his daughter, the miracle of music that bridges the gap between heaven and earth. Elara looked up at the ceiling of the church, and she could have sworn she saw a flicker of light in the rafters, a spark that pulsed in time with the beating of her heart. Thank you, Papa, she whispered so quietly that only she could hear. Thank you for teaching me to play. 2 years had passed since the competition in Vienna, and in that time the world had watched Elara Dulka transform from a village prodigy into an international sensation whose name was spoken with reverence in concert halls around the globe. She was 12 years old now, taller and more confident than the shy girl who had walked onto the stage in her hand-sewn white dress, but her eyes still held the same gentle light that had captivated millions. Tonight she stood backstage at Carnegie Hall in New York City, the most famous concert venue in the world, preparing to give her debut performance in front of the audience that included some of the most influential people in classical music. The sold-out crowd of nearly 3,000 people had paid extraordinary prices for their tickets, but the money would not go to Elara or her family. Every dollar from tonight's concert would be donated to the Andre Dalka Music Foundation, an organization that Sofia had created to honor her husband's memory by providing instruments and lessons to children from poor families around the world. The foundation had grown faster than anyone had expected, funded by donations that poured in from people who had been moved by Elara's story and her music. In just 2 years, they had distributed over 5,000 instruments to children in 23 countries, and they had established scholarship programs that allowed talented young musicians to attend conservatories they could never have afforded. Sofia had left her job as a cleaning woman behind forever, but she worked harder now than she ever had before, spending her days managing the foundation and her evenings supporting her daughter's studies and performances. She stood in the wings of Carnegie Hall watching Elara prepare, and she marveled at how much had changed since that long bus ride to Vienna. Are you nervous? She asked, adjusting the collar of Elara's elegant black dress, a far cry from the simple white one she had worn at her first competition. Elara shook her head and smiled, a calm and confident smile that reminded Sofia so much of Andre that her heart ached with love and loss. Papa is with me, Elara said simply, as she always did before a performance. How can I be nervous when he is with me? A few feet away stood Victor Brennan, who had become not just Elara's mentor but a beloved member of their small family. He had kept every promise he made that night in Vienna, funding Elara's education and using his connections to open doors that would have remained closed forever without his help. But more than that, he had become a different man. Transformed by his relationship with the girl who had reminded him why music mattered, he no longer judged competitions, having resigned from all such positions after Vienna, claiming that his years of cruelty had disqualified him from ever again sitting in judgment of young musicians instead. He spent his time teaching and mentoring, sharing everything he knew with students who reminded him of himself when he was young and full of dreams. "It's time," a stage manager said, appearing at Elara's side with a clipboard and an earpiece. "The audience is ready." Elara took a deep breath and looked at her mother and at Victor, the two people who had sacrificed so much to bring her to this moment. "For Papa," she whispered, the same words she had whispered before every performance since Vienna. And Sophia felt tears prick her eyes as they always did when she heard them. Victor squeezed Elara's shoulder gently, his eyes shining with pride and something that looked very much like fatherly love. "Go show them what music really means," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Go remind them why we are all here." Elara walked onto the stage of Carnegie Hall, and the audience rose to its feet before she had even reached the piano. The standing ovation lasted for over 2 minutes. A welcome so warm and so heartfelt that Elara had to blink back tears as she bowed and smiled and tried to express her gratitude without words. In the front row sat Victor and Sophia, side by side like old friends, which is exactly what they had become over the past 2 years. Beside them sat Helena, Victor's former colleague, who had become one of Sophia's closest confidants and a tireless advocate for the Andrei Dolka Foundation. And scattered throughout the audience were dozens of children who had received instruments or scholarships through the foundation, some of whom had traveled from as far as Brazil and Japan to witness this historic performance. When the applause finally faded and the audience took their seats, Elara sat down at the piano and placed her hands on the keys. She would play 3 pieces tonight, each one chosen for a specific reason, each one carrying a message that she wanted to share with the world. The first piece was the same Romanian folk song she had played in her village church, a tribute to her roots and to the community that had shaped her. The second piece was a new composition written by Victor especially for this concert, a gift from mentor to student that expressed everything he had learned about music since the day Elara had changed his life. And the third piece, the finale that would conclude the evening, was Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the same piece that had started everything in Vienna 2 years before. As the first notes of the folk song filled Carnegie Hall, Sophia closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. She thought about Andrei and the dreams he had carried with him to his grave, dreams of his daughter playing in the great concert halls of the world, dreams that he never lived to see come true. But he would have known, she thought, he would have known from the very beginning that this moment was coming, because he saw something in Elara that no one else could see, something that burned with a light that could never be extinguished. The music flowed through the hall, touching every heart that was open to receive it, and people who had never cried at a concert found themselves reaching for handkerchiefs when the folk song ended. Elara moved seamlessly into Victor's composition, a complex and beautiful piece that showcased her technical mastery, while also allowing her emotional depth to shine through. Victor watched with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the realization that his music was being given life by the most talented pianist he had ever known. He thought about all the years he had wasted in bitterness and cynicism, all the opportunities he had missed to appreciate the beauty that surrounded him, and he whispered a silent thank you to whatever force had brought Elara into his life. The final piece began, and the audience held its collective breath as the familiar opening notes of Chopin's Ballade floated through the air. Elara played it differently now than she had in Vienna. Not better or worse, but different, because she was a different person than she had been 2 years before. She had grown and learned and experienced things that had deepened her understanding of what music could express, and all of that growth was evident in every phrase she played. When the final chord faded into silence, there was a moment of absolute stillness, as if the entire hall was holding its breath. Then the audience erupted in the most thunderous ovation Carnegie Hall had heard in decades, 3,000 people leaping to their feet and shouting and crying and applauding until their hands hurt. Sophia and Victor stood together, their faces wet with tears, their hearts full of a joy so profound that it felt like it might overflow and flood the entire hall. Elara rose from the piano bench and bowed, her face glowing with a happiness that had nothing to do with fame or success and everything to do with love. She looked at her mother and at Victor and at all the people who had come to hear her play, and she felt her father's presence surrounding her like a warm embrace. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself as the applause continued to thunder around her. "This is just the beginning of everything you dreamed of, Papa." And somewhere beyond the reach of mortal eyes, in a place where music never ends and love never dies, Andrei Dolka watched his daughter take her place among the greatest pianists the world had ever known. His little star had risen at last, and her light would shine for generations to come, inspiring countless children to pick up instruments and chase their own dreams. The promise had been kept, the legacy had begun, and the music would play on forever. This was not an ending but a beginning, the first chapter of a story that would continue to unfold for years and decades to come, touching lives and changing hearts and proving once and for all that sometimes the greatest miracles come in the smallest packages. And every time someone asked Elara about her success, she gave the same answer, the same simple truth that had guided her from the very beginning. "My father taught me to play," she would say with a smile that held both joy and sorrow, "and everything I am, everything I will ever be, Is because of him the pianist who had laughed was now her greatest champion. The world that had doubted her now celebrated her name, and the little girl from Romania had become a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been told their dreams were impossible. This is the power of music, the power of love, and the power of a promise kept against all odds.